They banned his rusted shovel tripwire until it destroyed a scout car. Part 1. The Garbage Weapon. In the mud-soaked trenches of combat, the difference between life and death isn't always $1 million missile. Sometimes it's a piece of junk that everyone else told you to throw away. Meet Sergeant Elias Thorne. He wasn't a weapons designer or an engineer. He was a combat engineer who had seen too many textbook traps fail because they were too complicated for the jungle. He wanted something fast, something invisible, and something that cost $0. He found his answer in a heap of scrap metal behind the mess hall, a broken, rusted trenching shovel. To his commanding officer, it was garbage. To the safety inspectors, it was a hazard. They officially banned Thorne from using his shovel traps, claiming they were unreliable and violated protocol. They told him to stick to the standard issue tripwires. But Elias Thorne knew something the officers didn't. The enemy was looking for wires. They weren't looking for a rusted piece of metal buried in the dirt. He waited until the sun went down, grabbed his forbidden shovel, and went to work in the no-man's land of the valley. The physics of the scrap, the Thorne shovel, wasn't just a blunt instrument. It was a masterpiece of low-tech physics. Thorne had realized that a standard tripwire is thin and can be snapped or spotted by a careful scout. But a rusted shovel blade, buried at a 45-degree angle and connected to a high-tension spring, acted like a mechanical trigger with massive surface area. He buried the shovel just an inch below the surface of a muddy track. He connected the handle to a captured 82mm mortar shell buried deep in the ground. The logic was brutal. A human foot might step over a wire. But a vehicle's tire? A vehicle's tire exerts thousands of pounds of downward pressure over a wide path. When that tire hit the buried shovel, the rust provided the perfect amount of friction to hold the firing pin until the weight was absolute. It was a pressure plate made from a jumyard. The forbidden line. The next morning, the captain saw Thorne returning from the perimeter. He saw the red mud on Thorne's boots and the empty spot where the rusted shovel used to be. "I told you to stop with that junk, Sergeant," the captain barked. "If that thing doesn't work, the enemy scouts will walk right into our lap. Consider yourself on report." Thorne didn't say a word. He just pointed toward the tree line, 300 yards away. At that exact moment, the low growl of a diesel engine echoed through the valley. It was a German-made light scout car, the eyes of the enemy advance. It was fast, armored, and equipped with a 20mm autocannon. The scout car was moving confidently, its driver avoiding the areas where he suspected standard mines and wires would be hidden. He stayed on the safe muddy track, the exact spot where Thorne had buried his forbidden stool. The moment of impact, the scout car's front right tire rolled over the patch of brown mud. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the weight of the 3-ton vehicle pressed the rusted shovel blade into the earth. The spring released. The firing pin struck the mortar shell. The explosion wasn't just a pop, it was a volcano. The 82mm shell exploded directly under the scout car's axle. The force was so violent, it lifted the entire front end of the armored vehicle 6 feet into the air. The axle snapped like a dry twig. The engine block was shoved upward through the dashboard. The unreliable junk had just decapitated the enemy's lead scout. The silence of the officers back at the command post. The captain stood frozen, his binoculars still raised to his eyes. The scout car was now a burning wreck, blocking the only path forward for the enemy column. The banned weapon had done what $1,000 of high-tech gear couldn't. It had turned a rusted shovel into a wall. The captain turned to Thorne. He didn't put him on report. He didn't mention the safety protocols. Instead, he looked at the rest of the pile of scrap metal behind the bunker. "Sergeant," the captain said quietly, "how many more of those shovels can you find?" The shovel trap wasn't a joke anymore. It was the new standard of the valley. Thorne had proven that in war, the only safety violation that matters is the one that lets the enemy get through. The Reaper didn't need a scythe. He just needed a shovel. Part 2. The Trench War Sniper. After the fireball that claimed the enemy scout car, the men in the valley stopped laughing at Elias Thorne's garbage piles. But the enemy wasn't stupid. They learned. The high command of the opposing force realized that the roads were no longer safe for wheels or tracks. They shifted their strategy. They stopped using engines and started using ghosts. These were elite infantry squads, trained to crawl through the waist-deep mud, snip through barbed wire, and slip into American trenches in the dead of night to slit throats in the dark. The enemy believed no trap could catch a professional soldier moving an inch at a time. They believed Thorne's shovel mines were only triggered by the heavy weight of a vehicle. But Elias Thorne wasn't just a mechanic, he was a hunter. And he knew that in the silence of the trenches, the winner isn't the one with the biggest gun, it's the one who controls the direction of death. Thorne began to collect even more rusted, discarded shovels. But this time, he didn't bury them flat. He stood them up. The engineering of the Iron Rain. What Thorne created next was something modern weapons experts would later call the poor man's claymore. He realized that a standard explosion is wasteful. It sends energy in every direction, into the air and into the ground. Thorne wanted all that power to scream forward, exactly where the enemy was crawling. He used the blade of a rusted trenching shovel as a reflector. He meticulously bent the edges of the blade into a parabolic curve. In front of that curve, he packed a mixture of jagged scrap metal, rusted nails, and steel ball bearings salvaged from broken truck axles. Behind that wall of scrap, he placed a small charge of plastic explosive harvested from dud grenades. When the trap triggered, the rusted shovel blade acted like a mirror for the blast. Instead of light, it focused destruction. Every nail and bearing was launched at supersonic speeds in a narrow cone, clearing everything in a 20-yard path. And this trap didn't need a heavy pressure plate. Thorne used hair-thin wires, sometimes literally using copper strands from a radio or high-tension guitar strings that were invisible even under a full moon. The 2 a.m. infiltration. That night, a cold drizzle turned the valley into a gray blur. Visibility dropped to less than 15 feet. A squad of 12 enemy commandos, armed with suppressed submachine guns and blackened knives, began their crawl across the no-man's land. They moved like snakes, no sound, no light. They had studied standard military minefields and knew exactly how to bypass them. They cleared the first line of barbed wire. They were inches away from the lip of the trench where Thorne's unit was stationed. The lead commando signaled a halt. He felt the ground with his bare hands, searching for the smooth plastic or cold steel of a standard-issue tripwire. He found nothing. He moved forward another 12 inches. His shoulder brushed against a wire thinner than a spider's silk. That wire didn't pull a shiny metal pin. It released a rusted spring taken from an old field cot. The click was so small it was swallowed by the sound of the rain. But the consequence was deafening. The storm of rusted iron. The explosion wasn't a blinding flash, but it was absolutely devastating. The rusted shovel, hidden beside a rotting tree stump, erupted. Hundreds of rusted nails and steel bearings tore through the curtain of rain. Because the trap was set at ankle height, the entire cone of metal swept across the ground just 6 inches high. In a single second, the 5 lead commandos were shredded. They didn't have time to scream. The jagged, dirty metal tore through their camouflage and buried itself deep in their limbs and torsos. The remaining 7 soldiers panicked. Instinctively, they stood up to run. That was exactly what Thorne had calculated. 10 yards behind them, a second shovel positioned at a higher angle was waiting. As the survivors ran into the second kill zone, they hit the second wire. This time, the iron rain hit them at chest level. The silence of the night was shattered by the thud of exploding steel and the cries of the crows, wounded as they tried to crawl back into the darkness. The verdict of the trenches. The next morning, as the sun rose over the valley, the scene at the perimeter made even the veteran soldiers turn away. The officers found the rusted shovels still standing, though their faces were blackened by the blast. They still looked like pieces of junk to anyone walking by. The captain, The man who had originally banned these devices walked along the edge of the trench. He looked at the shovels, and then he looked at the rusted nails buried deep into the trees behind the kill zone. He realized this wasn't just a MacGyver trick. This was a revolution in asymmetric warfare. "Sergeant," the captain said, his voice no longer sharp with authority, but heavy with respect. "You've turned the things we throw away into the things the enemy can never defend against. From now on, every platoon in this sector needs a shovel expert like you." Thorn quietly picked up a shovel blade that had been bent by the explosion, wiping away the mud with a greasy cloth. "She's still good," he said. "Just needs a new spring and a fresh load of scrap." The trap didn't just stop the enemy. It killed the arrogance of those who believed high-tech gear was the only way to win a war. Part 3. The bureaucracy breaks. In the military, there is a saying, "If it's stupid and it works, it isn't stupid." But for the men in the Pentagon and the high-ranking officers at division headquarters, there is a different rule. If it works, but it isn't in the manual, it's a problem. By the third week of the Valley campaign, Sergeant Elias Thorne's rusted Reaper traps had become a legend among the infantry. The enemy was terrified to step off the paved roads. The American soldiers were sleeping better, but the paper trail was catching up. A supply auditor at the base camp noticed a strange pattern. Thorne's unit had stopped requesting standard-issue anti-personnel mines. They weren't using the expensive high-tech sensors shipped from the States. Instead, they were requesting massive amounts of industrial lubricant, high-tension springs, and most confusingly, every broken shovel in the scrapyard. 3 days later, the dust from a convoy of clean black jeeps announced the arrival of the brass. Brigadier General Marcus Vance stepped out of his vehicle, his boots polished to a mirror shine, looking at the muddy trenches with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. He hadn't come to congratulate Thorne, he had come to standardize him. The standardization trap General Vance stood in Thorne's makeshift workshop, a dugout filled with the smell of gunpowder and old iron. On the table sat a single jagged, rusted shovel blade rigged to a spring. "Sergeant," the general said, poking the shovel with his glove. "Intelligence says you've accounted for over 40 enemy casualties and 3 disabled vehicles using this. We've been spending millions of dollars on the Mark V proximity sensor, and you're using a garden tool." Thorne wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "The Mark V doesn't like the mud, sir. The shovel loves it." The general didn't care about the mud. He cared about acquisition. Within an hour, a team of contractors from a major defense firm were taking photos and measurements of Thorne's scrap pile. They began talking about contracts, blueprints, and mass production. They wanted to create the official version, the D109 directional fragmentation device. They planned to make it out of high-grade aluminum. They wanted to give it a digital trigger. They wanted to paint it olive drab. And they estimated that each official shovel would cost the taxpayers $2,000. Thorne watched them work, his eyes narrowing. "You're missing the point, sir," Thorne whispered to his captain. "The reason it works is because it's junk." The lab versus the mud. 2 weeks later, the official prototypes arrived. They were beautiful. The aluminum blades were shiny. The triggers were calibrated by computers. The springs were made of aerospace-grade titanium. General Vance invited a group of reporters and high-ranking officials to a live fire demonstration at the edge of the valley. He wanted to show off the military's new low-cost innovation. 10 of the official mines were set up in a row. A target dummy was dragged across the tripwire. Click, nothing happened. The aerospace-grade titanium spring had jammed because a single grain of valley sand had entered the precision-engineered trigger housing. The second mine detonated, but the aluminum blade was too light. Instead of focusing the blast forward, the blade shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces, sending the shrapnel in every direction, including back toward the spectators. The general's face turned red. The standardized version was a failure because it was too perfect. It didn't have the weight of the old steel. It didn't have the grit of the rust to hold the friction. The intelligence leak while the general was fuming over his failed prototypes. The enemy was preparing their largest offensive yet. They had captured a scout who told them about the official American mines. They had studied the shiny aluminum fragments. They knew the digital triggers could be jammed by radio frequency. They believed the shovel menace was over. But Elias Thorne hadn't used a single one of the general's new toys. While the officers were arguing in the command tent about budgets and blueprints, Thorne and his squad were back in the no man's land. They were burying the real thing. Thorne had found a new source of scrap, old railway spikes and rusted barbed wire. He was building what he called the Grand Piano, a series of 12 rusted shovels linked to a single, heavy-duty truck battery. It was a weapon that didn't exist in any manual. It had no official serial number. And because it wasn't standardized, the enemy's radio jamming equipment was useless against it. The silence before the storm at midnight. The general ordered Thorne to remove his illegal traps to make room for a new shipment of standard mines. "They're a safety hazard, Sergeant," Vance shouted. "We have a protocol for a reason. Clear the perimeter by dawn, or I'll have your stripes." Thorne looked at the general, then looked at the dark tree line where his sonar operators were picking up the sound of heavy boots. The enemy was coming. Thorne had to make a choice: follow the protocol and watch his unit get overrun, or keep his junk in the ground and face a court-martial. He walked back to his workshop, grabbed a rusted wrench, and looked at his men. "The general says the shovels are rack," Thorne said, using a word he'd picked up from a traveler. "So let's show him what a pile of rack can do to an army." He didn't pull the traps, he added more. The verdict of the night: the bureaucracy had broken the system, but the rust was about to fix it. As the first enemy flare lit up the sky, General Vance stood in the safety of his bunker, waiting for his standardized defenses to work. He didn't know that the only thing standing between him and the enemy bayonets was a piece of scrap metal that cost nothing. The rusted Reaper was about to face its greatest test. Not against a scout car, and not against a squad of ghosts, but against an entire battalion of infantry. Thorne sat in the mud, his hand on a rusted lever. He wasn't thinking about blueprints or defense contracts. He was thinking about the click. The bureaucracy was about to learn that you can't mass-produce grit. Part 4, The Final Harvest, The Symphony of Scrap. The clock was ticking toward 4 a.m. In the command bunker, General Marcus Vance was looking at his watch, ready to sign the papers that would strip Sergeant Elias Thorne of his rank. Outside, the valley was a wall of black silk and freezing mist. The standardized aluminum mines, the ones that cost the taxpayers $2,000 apiece, were sitting in their neat rows, their digital sensors blinking error, as the humidity of the valley short-circuited their precision boards. General Vance thought he was in control. He thought his protocol would keep the enemy at bay. He was wrong. A mile away, an entire battalion of enemy infantry was moving through the tall grass. They weren't crawling anymore. They knew the American electronic sensors were failing. They were jogging, weapons ready, a wave of steel and shadow destined to overrun the American line before the sun touched the horizon. But they didn't know about the Grand Piano, the masterpiece of the junkyard. Sergeant Elias Thorne sat in a hole 40 yards behind the perimeter. His hands were covered in black grease. In front of him was a wooden board with a series of rusted copper switches. He had ignored the general's order to clear the area. Instead, he had spent the last 4 hours wiring 12 Reaper traps together. This was the Grand Piano. He had loaded these shovels with more than just nails. He had packed them with railway spikes, broken glass, and shards of cast iron from a destroyed stove. He had wired them to a heavy-duty truck battery he had scavenged from a burned-out transport. "Sergeant," his private whispered, his teeth chattering from the cold. "If we pull this lever and it fails, the general is going to hang us. If we pull it and it works, he might hang us anyway." Thorne didn't look up. He was listening to the ground. Through a simple metal pipe driven into the earth, he could hear the thump, thump, thump of 1,000 boots. "The general isn't here," Thorn said quietly. "The mud is here. And the mud wants its due." The failure of the future, the enemy battalion reached the first line of official defenses. One soldier stepped directly onto the pressure plate of a standardized Mark V mine. Click. The aerospace-grade titanium spring, clogged with a single drop of frozen mud, failed to release. The enemy soldier paused, realized he was alive, and signaled his men to keep moving. They began to laugh. They thought the Americans had run out of teeth. They pushed forward, entering the killing bottle, a narrow neck of the valley where the terrain forced them to bunch together. In the bunker, the general saw the red lights on his display go dark. "The sensors are down," Vance shouted. "Order a retreat." The line is broken, but Thorn wasn't retreating. He was waiting for the enemy to reach the sweet spot. The grand piano plays. At 4:12 a.m., Thorn saw the silhouettes of the enemy leaders emerging from the fog. They were less than 30 yards away, now, Thorn whispered. He slammed the first 3 switches on the board. Boom, boom. The first chord of the grand piano played. 3 rusted shovels, hidden behind a pile of old tires, erupted simultaneously. The railway spikes and cast iron shards didn't just fly. They screamed. Because the shovels were U-shaped, the blast didn't scatter, it traveled like a solid wall of lead. The front of the enemy column was simply erased. Thorn didn't stop. He hit the next 4 switches. Boom, boom, boom. The crossfire was perfect. The iron rain hit the battalion from the left and the right. The enemy soldiers, who had been laughing moments before, were now trapped in a horizontal hail of scrap metal. The grand piano was playing a symphony of physics and rust. The air was filled with the smell of ozone, burnt gunpowder, and the clang of metal hitting metal. The rusted shovels held. Their heavy steel didn't shatter like the aluminum prototypes. They acted like cannons, focusing every ounce of energy into the valley. The morning after, when the sun finally rose, the valley was silent. The enemy battalion had retreated in total disarray, leaving behind a battlefield that looked like it had been hit by a tornado made of hardware. General Vance walked out of his bunker, his pristine boots finally getting covered in the thick red mud he had hated so much. He walked past his broken Mark V mines. He walked past the shiny, shattered aluminum. And then he stopped at Thorn's hole. He saw the grand piano board. He saw the 12 blackened, bent, but still standing rusted shovels. He saw the truck battery and the tangle of scavenged copper wire. The general looked at Thorn, who was leaning against a trench wall, smoking a cigarette he'd made from scavenged tobacco. Vance looked at the report in his hand, the one that would have court-martialed Thorn. Slowly, the general tore the paper into small pieces and let them fall into the mud. "Sergeant," the general said, his voice barely a whisper, "I want a full report on the structural integrity of these garden tools. And I want it on my desk by noon." Thorn blew out a cloud of smoke. "Sorry, sir, I'm out of shovels. I'll have to go find some more garbage." The legacy of the Reaper. The Thorn shovel was never officially adopted by the United States Army. It was too ugly for the manuals. It was too simple for the contractors. But for decades after the war, in the jungles of Vietnam, in the mountains of Afghanistan, and in every conflict where a soldier was outnumbered and outgunned, the legend of the Rusted Reaper lived on. It taught a generation of warriors a vital lesson. Technology is a tool, but grit is a weapon. Elias Thorn went back to civilian life after the war. He opened a small repair shop in a quiet town. People said he could fix anything with a piece of wire and a bit of spit. He never talked about the valley. He never talked about the general. But in the back of his shop, hanging on the wall, was a single, bent, rusted trenching shovel. It wasn't for digging. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can have is the thing everyone else told you to throw away. The Reaper didn't need a scythe, he just needed a shovel. And a little bit of rust. Part 5. The Global Echo. The victory in the valley was more than a tactical success. It was a crack in the foundation of modern military thinking. By the summer of 1945, the official reports from General Vance's headquarters had reached the high-ranking officers in Washington. They saw the failed aluminum prototypes and the missing budget for standard mines. But deep in the classified folders, there was a secondary report, a report written by the men who actually held the line. They didn't call it the T-109 project. They called it Thorn's Solution. Word of the shovel man had spread through the infantry like a wildfire. In the military, news travels faster through the mess halls than through the radio towers. Every sergeant who had a scrap pile and a problem began to wonder, if Thorn could stop a battalion with a rusted shovel, what could they do with the junk in their own backyards? The rusted reaper was no longer just a weapon. It was a philosophy. The underground manual. The most fascinating part of the Thorn legend isn't what happened in the trenches, it's what happened in the pockets of the Guias. A secret underground manual began to circulate among the engineering corps. It wasn't printed on government presses. It was hand-sketched on the back of cigarette cartons and ration boxes. It was called the Book of Rust. The manual didn't contain complex math or physics equations. It contained proverbs of the scrapyard. Rule number 1. If it's shiny, the enemy will find it. If it's rusted, the enemy will step on it. Rule number 2. The best trigger is the one you find in a broken chair. Rule number 3. Don't wait for the supply chain. The supply chain is under your feet. In the European theater, paratroopers use these sketches to turn broken bicycle frames into spring-loaded tripwires. In the Pacific, Marines used rusted tin cans filled with jagged coral and black powder to create island claymores. Elias Thorn had inadvertently started the world's first open-source weapons program. The shovel versus the heavy panzer. One of the most incredible stories to emerge from the Thorn effect happened during the final push toward the Rhine. An American squad was pinned down by a lone German Tiger tank, a massive 60-ton beast that the infantry's standard bazookas couldn't penetrate. They were out of anti-tank mines. They were out of hope. But their sergeant had seen the sketches from Thorn's Valley campaign. He didn't have a shovel, but he had the logic. He took 2 heavy steel railroad plates and rigged them into a leverage trap. He didn't try to blow the tank up. He used the Thorn spring to flip a steel bar into the drive sprocket of the tank as tread. When the 60-ton Tiger moved forward, the steel bar jammed the gears. The massive tank threw a track, rendering the beast immobile. A 60-ton Titan was defeated by 50 pounds of scrap metal and a rusted spring. The Reaper had moved from the mud of the valley to the iron of the panzer divisions. The post-war ghost. When the war finally ended, the military tried to collect all the improvised devices. They wanted to erase the Thorn solution from history because they couldn't control it. They couldn't sell it, and they couldn't standardize it. But you can't collect a ghost. In the late 1950s, French farmers in the valley where Thorn fought began finding strange artifacts in their fields. They weren't just old helmets or canteens. They found rusted shovel blades with heavy-duty springs, still attached traps that had sat in the earth for over a decade. Still waiting for a click, some of these ghost traps were still active. The rust friction that Thorn had discovered was so effective that the springs had stayed under tension for 15 years. Modern bomb disposal experts who studied these antique traps were horrified. They found that the Thorn triggers were more difficult to disarm than modern electronic mines because they were unpredictable. Everyone was unique. Everyone was a puzzle of scrap. The architect of the ordinary back in his small town in America, Elias Thorn lived a quiet life. He never claimed to be an inventor. He never asked for a patent. He spent his days fixing tractors and his nights reading the newspaper. But every now and then, a stranger would walk into his shop. Usually, it was a man in an old army jacket with a limp or a scar. They didn't come to talk about the war. They came to show him a drawing or a small mechanical part they had fixed. They would shake his hand, look at the bent shovel on his wall, and say, "Thank you, Sarge, that shovel saved my boys." Thorn would just nod, wipe the grease from his hands, and get back to work. He understood that the greatest honor isn't a medal from a general. It's the fact that your junk brought a father back to his children. The final lesson, the Thorn Theory. Today, in the most advanced military academies in the world, from West Point to Sandhurst, they teach something called asymmetric logic. It is the study of how a smaller, less equipped force can defeat a giant through resourcefulness. And at the heart of that curriculum is the story of the Rusted Reaper. It reminds the high-tech warriors of the 21st century that a billion-dollar satellite can be defeated by a man with a shovel. If that man knows how to think, the Rusted Reaper isn't just a story about a war. It's a story about the human spirit, the part of us that refuses to give up. Even when we are told that our ideas are garbage, the hunt is over, the war is finished. But the next time you see a piece of rusted metal in the dirt, look closer. It might just be the most powerful weapon ever made. The Reaper is still watching, and he's still holding a shovel. Part 6, The Last Secret. Time has a way of burying the truth. For 80 years, the valley where Sergeant Elias Thorne played his grand piano was reclaimed by the forest. The trenches filled with dead leaves. The craters became small, stagnant ponds. The rusted shovels, everyone assumed, had simply turned back into the red dust from which they came. But in the spring of 2024, a team of forensic archaeologists and military historians returned to the valley, armed with ground-penetrating radar and the latest smart sensors. They expected to find nothing more than a few shell casings and perhaps a rotted boot. What they found instead was a mechanical ghost that challenged everything we thought we knew about the Reaper. Deep beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree, their radar picked up a massive metallic signature. It wasn't a tank. It wasn't a bomb. It was a perfectly preserved, deep-buried version of a Thorn Trap 1 that had never been triggered. And as they carefully brushed away the dirt, they realized that Elias Thorne had a final secret he never told the general. The harmonic trigger. The historians were baffled. This wasn't just a shovel with a spring. This was a series of 5 shovel blades arranged in a perfect circle, pointing inward toward a central point. When the engineers analyzed the mechanism, they made a chilling discovery. Thorne hadn't just been using weight to trigger his traps. He had been using vibration. He had tuned the tension on the rusted springs so precisely that they would only release if they detected the specific frequency of a heavy diesel engine or massive marching feet. It was a mechanical computer. Without a single battery, without a single microchip, Thorne had built a smart mine that could distinguish between a wandering cow and an enemy squad. The rust wasn't just for camouflage. The layers of iron oxide acted as a sound filter. It was a level of genius that the Pentagon's million-dollar contractors couldn't replicate today. The Rusted Reaper wasn't just a survivor, he was an architect of the impossible. The interrogation of the last shadow. The research team tracked down the last surviving member of the enemy battalion that had faced the grand piano that night in 1944. He was 98 years old, living in a quiet village in Bavaria. When they showed him a photo of the recovered shovel, his hands began to shake. "We didn't fear the fire," the old man whispered. "We feared the nothing. We knew the Americans had better planes and bigger tanks. But we felt like the earth was fighting us. Every time we stepped on a piece of trash, we felt like the ground was screaming." He told them a story that wasn't in any official report. He said that after the first 3 chords of Thorne's Trap, the remaining soldiers didn't just retreat, they surrendered to the silence. They believed the valley was haunted by a spirit that turned their own weapons against them. Elias Thorne hadn't just won a battle. He had won a war of the mind, the Thorne constant today. In the world of high-tech defense, engineers talk about the Thorne constant. It is a theory that the more complex a system becomes, the more fail points it creates. A digital sensor can be jammed. A satellite can be blinded. A drone can be hacked. But how do you hack a rusted shovel? How do you jam a spring that has been buried for 80 years? The modern military is now looking back at Thorne's trash with new eyes. They are developing non-electronic backup systems based on his mechanical logic. They are learning that sometimes, to move forward, you have to look at the scrap pile. In the high-security labs of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, there's a small display case. Inside is not a piece of a rocket or a laser. It is a rusted trenching shovel, recovered from the valley. It stands as a warning to every engineer. Do not forget the mud, the final message. When the archaeologists finally disassembled the 5-blade trap they found under the oak tree, they found a small, airtight metal canister hidden inside the central trigger. Inside was a piece of paper, yellowed with age but perfectly legible. It wasn't a blueprint. It wasn't a map. It was a note written in Elias Thorne's rough, blocky handwriting. It said, "To the man who finds this, if you are looking at this note, it means the war is over, or I am gone. Either way, I hope you found a better use for this shovel than I did. Dig a garden, build a house. But never forget that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a bomb. It's a man who has nothing left but his hands and a reason to fight." The last secret of the Reaper wasn't a weapon at all. It was a reminder. The end of the Rusted Reaper series ends here, in the quiet halls of history. Sergeant Elias Thorne passed away decades ago, but his ghost still patrols the boundaries of military thought. He remains the patron saint of the underdog, the man who proved that a pile of junk and a brilliant mind can stop a giant. The next time you see a rusted tool lying in a field, or a piece of scrap metal by the side of the road, don't just see wreck, see the potential. See the possibility, because somewhere in a valley you've never heard of, there might still be a grand piano waiting for its next click. The hunt is over. The Reaper is at rest, but the shovel is still there.